On the 5th of January 2002, in a Santa Monica apartment, a 77-year-old man named Frank White was beaten to death with a weight-training dumbbell. His son, a 46-year-old man then going by the name Albert Victor White, was arrested the same evening. Within days, prosecutors had assembled a case that would have been dismissed as implausible fiction if the paperwork did not exist to confirm every detail. The victim's real name was not Frank White. It was Pranas Brazinskas. The killer's real name was not Albert White. It was Algirdas Brazinskas, father and son. And 31 years earlier, on the 15th of October, 1970, these same two men had committed the first successful airline hijacking in the history of the Soviet Union, shooting and killing a 19-year-old flight attendant named Nadezhda Kurchenko in the process, wounding 3 other crew members, and commandeering an Aeroflot turboprop from the Soviet state of Georgia to the Turkish coast. They had escaped the Soviet Union. They had survived Turkish prison. They had been allowed to settle in the United States despite Soviet protests that reached the level of formal diplomatic confrontation. They had become, in the calculus of the Cold War, acceptable liabilities. Men who had committed violence against a communist state's property and personnel, and whom the West had quietly chosen not to return. And then, in a Santa Monica apartment, the story concluded the way it had always been heading, with one of them dead on the floor and the other standing over him. The Aeroflot Flight 244 case presents 3 paradoxes that define the geopolitical absurdity of the Cold War legal order. Paradox 1. The murder of Nadezhda Kurchenko was prosecuted by Turkey, which had no direct connection to the crime, no Soviet victims among its citizens, and no particular interest in Soviet aviation law. Turkey convicted Pranas Brazinskas of manslaughter and sentenced him to 38 years. It convicted his 13-year-old son, Algirdas, on a lesser charge. Neither served their full sentence. Both were released under an amnesty provision in 1974. The Soviet Union, which had demanded extradition from the moment the aircraft landed on Turkish soil, received nothing. Paradox 2. The United States granted the Brazinskases the right to remain on American soil, not on the formal basis of political asylum. That was never officially granted, but on the practical basis that deporting them to the Soviet Union was politically unacceptable, and deporting them to Turkey, where they had already been convicted and released, was legally absurd. They existed in a bureaucratic limbo that the Cold War legal framework had not anticipated and did not know how to resolve. They were, technically, free men in America. Paradox 3, and this is the one that resists easy framing. The Soviet government's relentless pursuit of the Brazinskases through diplomatic channels, complaints filed annually through the 1980s, formal protests issued to every American administration from Nixon to Reagan, was not purely about justice for Nadezhda Kurchenko. It was about demonstrating that defection carried consequences, that the West could not simply absorb Soviet citizens who had committed crimes against the Soviet state and call it humanitarianism. The Brzezinskis were, for the Soviet Union, a propaganda problem as much as a legal one. And for Nadezhda Kurchenko, 19 years old when she died blocking the cockpit door of an Antonov AN-24 over the Black Sea, none of these paradoxes resolved anything. To understand why a Lithuanian father and his teenage son boarded Aeroflot Flight 244 on the 15th of October 1970, you need to understand what it meant to be Lithuanian in the Soviet Union in 1970. Lithuania had been an independent nation, briefly, imperfectly, but genuinely, between the 2 world wars. In 1940, the Soviet Union annexed it, along with the other Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia. The annexation was not recognized by most Western governments, a legal fiction that persisted through the entire Cold War. For Lithuanians who remembered independence, or who had been raised on the memory of it by parents who remembered independence, the Soviet state was an occupation force rather than a legitimate government. The resentment was deep, generational, and, in the Soviet system's terms, permanently criminal. Pranas Brazinskas was not, by any account, a pure political dissident. He had been convicted twice by Soviet authorities. In 1955 for financial crimes, and again in 1965 for further violations related to state commerce. He was, in the Soviet framework, a recidivist economic criminal. In the Lithuanian framework, he was a man who had found ways to operate outside a system he did not accept as legitimate. Whether these two framings are in conflict or simply describe the same behavior from different angles is a question the archives leave open. What is established is this. By October 1970, Pranas Brazinskas had a plan. He had a 13-year-old son named Algirdas. He had weapons, a pistol, and a sawed-off shotgun, smuggled aboard in luggage without any screening, because 1970 Soviet domestic aviation had no passenger security infrastructure of any meaningful kind. And he had selected seats closest to the cockpit on Aeroflot Flight 244, a short domestic hop from Batumi in the Georgian Soviet Republic to Sukhumi and then Krasnodar. The aircraft was an Antonov AN-24, a twin turboprop regional aircraft. 50 people aboard, 45 passengers, 4 crew, and 1 flight attendant. That flight attendant was Nadezhda Kurchenko, 19 years old, a recent graduate of aviation training school, on one of her early assigned flights. 5 minutes after takeoff, at 800 meters altitude, Pranas passed a threatening note to Kurchenko, demanding access to the cockpit. She did not step aside. She ran toward the cockpit door, shouting a warning to the pilots. Brazinskas shot her twice at point-blank range. She died from her wounds. 3 other crew members were wounded in the struggle that followed. The pilots, under duress, diverted the aircraft to Trabzon on the Turkish Black Sea coast. Father and son surrendered to Turkish authorities on the tarmac. The aircraft was returned to the Soviet Union. The passengers were returned. Kurchenko's body was returned in a sealed coffin. Pranas and Algirdas Brazinskas were taken into custody and prepared for trial. The Soviet response to the hijacking was instantaneous and furious, and in the context of international law as it existed in October 1970, essentially powerless. The existing legal framework for aviation crime was the Tokyo Convention of 1963, which addressed jurisdiction over offenses on aircraft, but did not mandate extradition of hijackers. In simple terms, the Tokyo Convention said that the state where a hijacked aircraft landed had jurisdiction. Turkey had jurisdiction. Turkey prosecuted, and Turkey, having prosecuted and convicted the Brazinskases, was under no binding international obligation to surrender them to any other state, including the Soviet Union, which was demanding their return to face charges of murder, treason, and aircraft piracy under Soviet law. The Soviet response escalated through every available diplomatic channel. The TASS news agency published editorials condemning Turkish passivity. The Soviet government lodged formal protests. Soviet diplomats in Ankara delivered what were described in diplomatic cables as unusually direct complaints about Turkey's handling of the extradition request. None of it produced the extradition. What made the Soviet position particularly galling, and what gave it its Cold War resonance, was the parallel it drew to Soviet behavior toward Western hijackers. The Soviets argued, with some factual basis, that when Western aircraft were hijacked to Cuba or Eastern European states, the West demanded immediate extradition and condemned any state that refused. The Brazinskases were being treated as political refugees, the Soviets argued, when they were in fact murderers. The West responded, essentially, that the Soviet Union did not have the moral authority to demand that other states return its citizens, given the Soviet Union's own record of not extraditing individuals sought by Western governments. Nadezhda Kurchenko, meanwhile, was commemorated extensively inside the Soviet Union. Streets were named after her. A monument was erected. Soviet aviation schools taught her story as an example of duty and sacrifice. She was 19 years old and had been doing her job. What the international diplomatic crisis of the Brazinskas case actually produced was a treaty, and this is the story's most significant structural consequence, larger than any individual fate. On the 16th of December 1970, approximately 2 months after Flight 244 was hijacked, diplomats from 50 nations gathered in The Hague and signed the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Seizure of Aircraft. The Hague Convention, as it became known, established for the first time a binding international obligation. States that detain hijackers must either extradite them or submit them to their own prosecutorial authorities for trial. No safe harbor. No political refugee exception for aviation pirates. The phrase that defines the convention is aut dedere aut judicare, either extradite or prosecute. The convention was signed in December 1970. It entered into force in October 1971. Its timing relative to the Brazinskas case was not coincidental. The Aeroflot 244 hijacking had exposed a specific gap in international aviation law, the gap through which Pranas and Algirdas had walked, and the international community closed it within 60 days. The Brazinskases were, however, already inside the gap. They had been tried, convicted, released under amnesty, and were by 1974 making their way through Venezuela toward the United States. The Hague Convention that their hijacking had helped create did not apply retroactively to their case. They arrived in America and were, after a complicated legal process, allowed to remain, not as political asylees, which was never formally granted, but as individuals whose deportation had no workable destination. They settled in Santa Monica, California, under changed names. Pranas became Frank White, Algirdas became Albert Victor White. They lived for nearly 3 decades in the same West Coast city that hosts celebrity award ceremonies, beach volleyball tournaments, and the kind of comfortable anonymity that large American coastal cities provide to people who wish not to be found. The Soviet Union protested their presence in America every year through the 1980s. The United States government acknowledged the protests and did nothing. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the protests stopped. The state making the demands had ceased to exist. Frank White and Albert White remained in Santa Monica. Here is what the Brazinskas story refuses to do. It refuses to be resolved by the legal mechanisms that were theoretically designed to resolve it. Turkey prosecuted them and released them. The Soviet Union demanded them and was refused. The United States hosted them and looked the other way. The Hague Convention was written partly in response to their crime and arrived too late to address it. Every institution that should have produced a reckoning produced instead a delay, a workaround, a technicality, a diplomatic abstention. And so the reckoning arrived through different means. On the 5th of January 2002, in an apartment in Santa Monica, Algirdas Brazinskas, Albert Victor White by then, 56 years old, beat his 77-year-old father to death during a family dispute. The precise cause of the argument was not fully established at trial. What was established was that it was violent, that it ended with Pranas dead and Algirdas standing in the apartment with a dumbbell, and that when police arrived, they uncovered, and tracing the identities of the men involved, the full 32-year arc of the Aeroflot hijacking, the Turkish trial, the Soviet protests, the American asylum, and the California alias. Algirdas was convicted of second-degree murder with a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to 16 years to life. The man who at 13 had boarded a Soviet turboprop with his father's gun in the luggage, who had witnessed the shooting of Nadezhda Kurchenko, who had survived Turkish prison and Soviet diplomatic pressure and 3 decades of American limbo, ended his story in a California courtroom, convicted of killing the same man who had started the whole thing. Let us consider what Pranas Brazinskas actually wanted and what he got. He wanted to leave the Soviet Union. He did that. He wanted to reach the West. He did that. He wanted freedom from a state he had spent decades fighting, legally and otherwise. He got 3 decades of it, in Santa Monica, in the sun, under a name that wasn't his. By any operational measure, his plan worked. The Soviet state that he had escaped from collapsed in 1991 and no longer existed to pursue him. He had outlasted his enemy. He was beaten to death by his son at age 77. Algirdas Brazinskas, who was 13 when he boarded that aircraft, who may or may not have fully understood the violence that was about to occur, who grew up carrying the weight of a murder that happened when he was barely a teenager and that he had played some role in enabling, served his Turkish sentence, his American legal proceedings, and 30 years of anonymous California existence. and then committed a second killing. The case file on him ends not in the Georgian Soviet Republic in 1970, but in a Los Angeles County courtroom in 2002. Nadezhda Kurchenko's name appears in the records of the Soviet memorial system, on a street sign in at least one former Soviet city, and in the archives of aviation safety institutions that cite her death as a case study in cockpit security vulnerability. She was 19. She was doing her job. The aircraft she died on continued to carry passengers after being repaired and returned to Aeroflot service. These are the three fates of the primary figures in the story. One died at 77 in a domestic dispute. One went to prison for killing him. One died at 19 trying to stop them. The Brazinskas case sits at a particular intersection of moral categories that legal systems are poorly equipped to address. Pranas Brazinskas committed murder. He also committed an act of political defection from a totalitarian state. These two things happened simultaneously in the same 5 minutes of the same flight. The moral weight of one does not cancel the moral weight of the other. But the political context of the Cold War consistently caused Western governments to treat the second as though it diminished the first. The result was that a man who shot and killed a 19-year-old woman doing her job never faced justice for that specific act from any authority with the power to impose it. The question this raises is not specific to the Brazinskas case. It is structural. International law, particularly in the Cold War era, had built into it a systematic asymmetry. Violence committed in the service of escaping communist states was treated differently, legally, politically, and rhetorically, than equivalent violence committed for other purposes. This asymmetry produced outcomes that were uncomfortable to acknowledge, because acknowledging them required either condemning people who had fled genuine oppression or excusing acts that were objectively criminal. The Istanbul scholar who reviewed the Turkish conviction records noted in a published analysis that Pranas Brazinskas received 38 years for manslaughter rather than murder, a classification that itself reflected the political circumstances of the trial. The Turkish court was not staffed by ideologues, but it was operating within a political environment in which the Soviet Union's credibility as an aggrieved party was compromised by its own human rights record. Algirdas Brazinskas's California murder conviction, by contrast, produced no such ambiguity. There was no Cold War framework to complicate it. There was no political dimension to invoke. There was a dead man and a dumbbell and a son. The moral paradox of the case is that it required 52 years and a second killing to produce a legal outcome that was uncomplicated by politics. The Aeroflot 244 case left marks on 3 separate institutional bodies that remain visible today. In aviation law, the Hague Convention of 1970, signed in direct response to the crisis the hijacking exposed, remains one of the foundational instruments of international aviation security law. It has been ratified by the majority of United Nations member states and continues to govern the legal obligations of states that detain aircraft hijackers. Its core principle, extradite or prosecute, has been extended by subsequent conventions to cover a broader range of aviation offenses. In Soviet memorial culture, Nadezhda Kurchenko became one of the most extensively commemorated civilian victims of aviation crime in Soviet history. The state apparatus that managed Soviet heroic mythology processed her death as an act of duty and sacrifice. A flight attendant who chose resistance over compliance and paid with her life. In Cold War legal scholarship, the case is studied in international law programs as a paradigm example of the tensions between state sovereignty, individual refugee claims, aviation security obligations, and the political instrumentalization of extradition. Eric R. Scott's scholarly analysis, published in the journal Past and Present in 2018, documents how the case illuminated the limits of Cold War-era international institutions. The flight number 244, incidentally, is still in use on the Aeroflot network today. It now flies from Moscow to the Seychelles. In Santa Monica, the street where Pranas and Algirdas Brazinskas lived their final California years has no marker, no memorial, no indication that 2 men who made international legal history once paid rent on it. In a city in the former Soviet Union, a street named after Nadezhda Kurchenko continues to exist, though the state that named it does not. The 19-year-old woman who ran toward a cockpit door is commemorated by the country she tried to protect in the last seconds of her life. In a California prison facility, Algirdas Brazinskas, Albert Victor White, served his sentence. He was convicted in 2002. He was sentenced to 16 years to life. His current status in the California correction system has not been made public. In The Hague, the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Seizure of Aircraft remains in force. Its text does not mention the Aeroflot flight that made it necessary. 3 stories, 1 aircraft, a 19-year-old woman who did her job, a father and son who did theirs. Whatever that means when the job is a hijacking and the ending is a California apartment, and the instrument is a dumbbell. And the only institution that finally produced an uncomplicated verdict was a Los Angeles jury 52 years after the thing started. Was it justice? Or just the story finding the only ending it had left?